In this video, I'll present some data on Starship's flight tests, but I think it's important to first discuss why it is vitally important for us to make data-driven decisions when it comes to human spaceflight. You see, I think that human spaceflight is at a crossroads. Let me try to explain what I mean by this. Here in the West, we believe that when individuals are encouraged to think independently and speak freely, greater efficiency and productivity naturally follow. But is this really true? Does our system of government self-correct better than others? Or are we still vulnerable to stagnation, corruption, and misinformation? Can these forces, if left unchecked, quietly drain our momentum and steer us off course? How do we verify that our system of government really works? Well, the supporters of an ideology can prove that their ideology works by achieving major milestones in human history, such as sending the first humans to space or landing the first humans on the moon. So when our human spaceflight program is on course, that's direct evidence that our system of checks and balances is working. When it comes to human spaceflight programs, what does it mean to be on course? This is one of those debatable questions, but to gain some insight, I think it would be helpful to listen to some testimony recently given in the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. You can find the full meeting linked below in the description.
To be effective, human space exploration missions cannot be one and done, but must be repeatable and sustainable with continuous presence as the norm. A revised Artemis campaign plan should be a high priority for the new administrator. There may be some painful adjustments with industry and our international partners, but it's better to do so now than to continue on an unsustainable and unaffordable path. The Artemis policy is a good one, supported by Congress and multiple administrations. However, we need a more sustainable and credible approach to maintain the confidence of the White House, Congress, industry, and our international partners.
This is about the long-term drive to be present, to lead, and become the first to establish the rules of the road, thus mastering the cislunar domain for the purposes of science, exploration, and commercial development. Today's race is about continuous presence, values, and technical leadership. The nation that leads is the nation that benefits. China is striving to lead the implementation and development of the infrastructure, retaining the high ground and reaping the economic benefit. China has declared that they will land humans on the moon before 2030. Of note, China has met every space milestone they have proposed within plus or minus a year. The United States must protect our potential economic opportunity, protect our national security, lead the building of the necessary infrastructure, and importantly, lead chartering the rules of the road. We must continue to lead the coalition between the Earth and the Moon, and we must bring international and commercial partners along with us. NASA's current plan to return people to the Moon requires approximately 35 to 40 Starship launches to first demonstrate the capability on an uncrewed mission and then execute the first human mission planned for Artemis 3. I ask this: can 40 launches, development and demonstration of the undeveloped and undemonstrated on-orbit rocket fuel station, and integration of a complex operational scenario across multiple systems all successfully occur by 2030? The probability of success for this plan is remote at best. Further, the United States does not have a sustainable plan for 2030 and beyond. We need to recognize the competitive environment, admit our true technical status and capability, provide the needed effort for success, and engage our international partners. Real challenging objectives to be accomplished and real problems to be solved will keep this workforce engaged and learning, all to accomplish the future. I offer the following recommendations. 3. Focus the NASA industry workforce on accomplishing the national objectives with real timelines and incentives to incorporate new capabilities from across industry, academic labs, and government labs with urgency and focus.
While important, continuity of purpose alone will not get us to the Moon and Mars. NASA needs sufficient resources, the necessary workforce and skills, safe and modern infrastructure and facilities, and a viable Artemis architecture couched in technical confidence. With each of these requirements, I'm afraid there are more questions than answers. We don't know if Artemis 3 and the future human landing approaches with their highly complex human landing systems and low technical readiness levels could be viable on a time frame that will ensure NASA astronauts land at the lunar South Pole and return safely to Earth, we hope in advance of China's taikonauts.
Excellent question, Congressman, and I will tell you it's a topic of debate, but I'll give you my opinion. Number two is I get myself a simplified lander so that I can get to the moon that does not require multiple launches. My 40 number comes from demonstrating it twice. I have to do the whole mission twice, once uncrewed and then crewed. Right. I need to get that number of launches dramatically reduced. I need to go simple.
You, in your testimony, mentioned that our missions can't be one and done. They have to be repeatable and sustainable. And you've kind of touched on the regulatory burdens. You've touched on barriers. You've touched on acquisition streamlining. I did want to ask specifically if there were specific regulations or specific provisions that you could mention, if we can dive into the weeds a little bit, that we need to examine.
I think the number one thing that I would say is to push responsibility down and to the agencies and hold them accountable. Don't have a one-size-fits-all. Take a scalpel, not just a grenade, to those things, and give the agencies both the leadership direction and the top cover necessary to go and experiment. I think, as Dr. Dumbacher said, we can actually do a lot of amazing things in getting stuff done if people think that they're not going to be penalized for trying and doing that. So I think agency accountability, I think pressing things down to a lower level in the agencies.
I'm fully with Dr. Pace's answer. I think we need to, as Scott has said, give people the leeway and hold them accountable to go experiment, and this nation can accomplish great things. What's important for our workforce is for them to see that they have real challenges, real problems to go solve, and they'll go do it. And then they will learn, and our society will reap the benefits. That's the important part. And we also have to realize that in this global competition, we need to tap all of the resources across this country to be able to compete with others. Just because China has a larger population than we do, we graduate 10 to 20% of the number of engineers on an annual basis at the undergraduate level compared to the Chinese. We're not going to win the numbers game. What we need to do is get the perspective, the talent, and tap into those communities that we haven't tapped into before to help make sure we're bringing all of the talent to bear across this country.
So there's been a long-term decline in the NASA budget over time. When talking about that, the pushback that I got was, great, happy to see more money going to NASA, but show me where the innovation is. Give me something that's innovative and new, not just another program of record. I mean, that was really the challenge. So I think if you're challenging NASA to say, okay, you need more resources, first tell me, how are you going to do this in a more sort of innovative kind of way?
So SLS proves yet again we have mastered the skills to build and operate chemical rockets for human lunar spaceflight. But it also proves something else, that such rockets persist in being incredibly expensive. In fact, they are prohibitively expensive if we agree that the next great milestone for human civilization is something truly ambitious. A base on the scale of McMurdo Station in Antarctica, for example, would be impossible under today's cost constraints. Is there an alternative? And is a fully reusable rocket, such as Starship, that alternative? Or is a fully reusable rocket just a repackaged attempt to solve tomorrow's problem with yesterday's technology? This is why it's critical that our system of government is guided by a clear and accurate understanding of Starship's capabilities, not by aspirational capabilities, not by the circular reporting that amplifies speculation in direct proportion to how sensational that speculation is. Can we trust our policymakers to get it right? To answer that, we can start by taking a keener interest in the inner workings of our government, beginning with the House Science and Technology Committee. Are our representatives truly informed and competent? Are they asking the right questions and making tough, fact-based decisions? Can we trust them to provide real oversight, challenge assumptions, and hold decision makers accountable? Or are they merely going through the motions while the course of the free world is set without any real scrutiny? If you watched the full meeting, you might be concerned. There were committee members who arrived late, others who read statements from a script but couldn't pronounce words like Orion and Taikonaut, and one who used her time to talk about healthcare and COVID without asking a single question relevant to the discussion or engaging with the witnesses.
Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Kenny. I know we're waiting for Mrs. Rivas. She's on her way, I understand. Congresswoman from California. We'll give her a little time. No problem. Representative from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate you giving me a few minutes to get in here. Somehow, I've only been coming here 2 years, but I got lost. You might figure Rayburn? No.
However, many of the representatives did arrive on time, were well informed, and did ask good questions. I hope that more people pay attention to which politicians are doing a great job and which aren't, and then vote for the right ones. Case in point, here's a great example of a congressperson doing their job well. Congressman Bill Foster, grilling NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine back in 2019. I think this represents the level of accountability and critical thinking that we need to demand from all of our elected officials.
You're talking about, essentially a program based on chemical rockets that would be completely understandable to Wernher von Braun, everything you're proposing. And there have been for, decades, conceptual designs for ways to get stuff into low Earth orbit for much less. For example, these are things like electromagnetic launch systems, air-breathing systems, and it seems like you're spending a negligible amount of stuff that actually has a chance to reduce the cost of getting stuff into low Earth orbit. And is that something that bothers you, or have you considered moving the needle on that so that actually we have a chance 50 or 100 years from now with having space be affordable to people, which I think is pretty clearly not going to happen if we just keep using chemical rockets again and again?
That's an important question. You're absolutely right. Chemical rockets are expensive. We're making really great advancements right now on the reusability of rockets, which is driving down cost and increasing
That's not a major effect. I visited SpaceX, when this was still conceptual, hadn't been proven yet, and I asked the question, okay, if you reuse the booster, how much, let's say it all works and that they're able to do it. You reduce your capacity to low Earth orbit because you have to retain fuel to land the booster. You have to go and take stuff apart, respace, qualify everything. How much money do you actually save? And the answer from the engineer at the time was you save 17%. That is not transformative. We need a factor of 10 in the reduction of costs, not whatever number you get from reusability of the first stage booster. So you have to spend money on transformative technologies, and I don't see that anywhere in your budget.
Now, if you're thinking, wait a minute, didn't reusable rockets succeed in dropping the cost of launch by a factor of 10? Then I encourage you to check out this video where I take a deeper dive into space launch cost trends, breaking down the numbers and explaining the economics of spaceflight in more detail. But critical thinking isn't the responsibility of just politicians. The broader spaceflight community has a role to play. Journalists, analysts, and influencers must go beyond surface level reporting, fact-checking sources, asking tough questions, and holding industry leaders and space agencies accountable. To that end, I've created a tool for content creators that uses optical character recognition to extract and analyze Starship test flight data. It should be easy enough to modify this tool to extract data from other companies' launches as well. I've also created a program that simulates a rocket launch. It has adjustable parameters, so you can fit the model's behavior to empirical data from a real launch. This is not easy to do, so I hope that more people with relevant engineering experience will pitch in to help improve it over time. I put GitHub links to both in the description below. Before we look at the data though, I just want to leave you with one last thought on why it's important. You see, the future is being written in real time, and the weight of this moment will only become clear in retrospect. Will this be an era remembered as a time of ambition, where knowledge and open discourse shaped a bold new course for humanity? Or will it be seen as a time when noise drowned out reason and the greatest opportunities slipped through our fingers? Now let's take a look at Starship test flight data, starting with Integrated Flight Test 1. The first test flight of Starship took place on April 20th in 2023. This graph is a graph of time, which is shown in seconds on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, we show the altitude of the Starship or the booster in kilometers, or we show the airspeed in units of hundreds of meters per second. On this test flight, the booster and the ship failed to separate, so we really get one kind of combined curve for altitude and also a combined curve for airspeed. If you recall, the the booster and the ship went up fairly high, and then they failed to separate, and then they started to tumble, and we lost signal, I think probably when the flight termination system was activated. So we only get a partial uh, plot from that particular test flight. The next flight, Starship IFT-2, took place on November 18th. It was a bit more successful. In this case, the booster and the ship continued up to this altitude where the booster and ship separated. And the booster shortly afterwards, I think it exploded for some reason. I forget why. And so we lost signal from it, and that's why the signal kind of goes horizontal. The ship, on the other hand, continued to increase in altitude. This point is the airspeed. It shows that the booster and the ship separated right about here. And just before they separated, there was a slight drop in velocity because the ship was no longer, the booster was no longer firing its engines, and it started to fall before the ship's engines took over. So then you can see the ship's airspeed increases and it gets all the way up to this speed here before it shuts off. The booster starts, I guess it turns around and starts heading back, but it must have also failed at this point because the telemetry ended, and so we have a dead signal again. Starship IFT-3 took place on March 14th in 2024. Again, the ship and the booster successfully separated. The ship increased its airspeed all the way to the point where it was on its suborbital trajectory before it shut down the engines. What's interesting here is you can actually see the engines don't just immediately shut down, but they reduce their power output briefly as they approach the target speed they want for their suborbital trajectory. The booster, you can see its airspeed changes as it turns around, comes back, and then heads down through the atmosphere, and eventually, I believe it went for a soft landing here in the ocean. In IFT-4, the booster made it to a slightly higher altitude, and the airspeed was also slightly higher. If I go back and forth between between 3 and 4, you can see that altitude, the altitude the booster reached is slightly higher. The airspeed that the booster and the ship reached before separation was about the same, slightly lower, I think. Again, the ship's airspeed increased and the thrust dropped off slightly before it reached the speed it wanted to be at to head towards the Indian Ocean. The booster has a much nicer curve on the return flight now. As it turns around, its speed drops, and then as it falls towards the Earth, its speed increases, and eventually it comes down for landing, a soft landing in the ocean, I think, in this case. Starship IFT-5 took place on October 13th, 2024. Very similar profile to the previous one. So we go back and forth. You can see there's similar shape, but what you do observe is that the booster did not reach quite as high an altitude in IFT-5 as it did in IFT-4. Speed at which they separated was also slower than it was in IFT-4. But again, it separated, went on a similar trajectory up towards the suborbital trajectory, and slowed its engines down before turning them off entirely. Okay, now let's take a look at IFT-6. IFT-6 is very similar to IFT-5. The trajectory for the airspeed for both the booster and the ship are almost identical, going back and forth. So IFT-7 was quite a bit different from IFT-6. First, we can note the booster's peak altitude was lower. So there's IFT-6, and there's IFT-7, IFT-6, IFT-7. And then the airspeed at which the separation occurred was also slower. So there's IFT-6, and there's IFT-7, IFT-6, IFT-7. Now, IFT-7 also didn't make it all the way to, I believe there was some kind of problem with the ship. But you can notice that it actually got pretty far. The speed slowed down. Possibly it was just that the engine started to fail. It's hard to say exactly what was going on there. But it didn't make it onto its orbital trajectory. And as you know, as most of you know anyway, it burnt up in the atmosphere over Turks and Caicos. Let's look at some overall trends for the Starship test flights, starting with the maximum altitude that the booster reached. So the maximum altitude that the booster reached on IFT-3 was up here. If we go to IFT-4, it was even slightly higher. And then as we go to IFT-5, you see it drops significantly. And IFT-6 is about the same. And then IFT-7, it's dropped even further. Now, we could speculate as to why that might be. It could be that the booster received more reinforcement so that they could attempt to tower catch. It could be because they added a Pez dispenser or even dummy satellites as a payload. Or it could be that they added additional weight to the heat shield to improve the chances that it survived reentry. Now we go back up to IFT3 again. This time let's look at the peak speed at separation. So we see here that in IFT3, it's up here, and then it goes down slightly for IFT4. It's about the same for IFT5, and again for IFT6, but then it drops again for IFT7. So the booster is not adding quite as much velocity as the test flights increase from 3 to 7. So I'll obviously have to see how SpaceX does on IFT8, if it improves or if it stays the same. But it's interesting to see that when you look at this data, we're not seeing forward progress in terms of delta V from the booster stage. We're seeing it seems to be actually declining in performance, or perhaps it's just declining because the ship is getting heavier in some manner. Let's look at the speed of the ship at about 450 seconds into flight. 450 seconds is before the time that the engine started shutting down on the ship in IFT7, by the way. So this is something where it gives us an indication of how fast the ship was able to go at a certain point in time after liftoff. All right, so IFT3, we can see that the speed of the ship is around here at maybe 55-ish, or 5,500 meters per second. If we go to IFT4, it actually improves slightly. And then IFT5, it improves even more, which is great. And IFT6, it's up to 6,000 meters per second at 450 seconds into the flight. So all improvement IFT3 through IFT6. But then on IFT7, it drops all the way down to 4,000 and maybe 700 meters per second. And this is before the engine's cut off on the ship. So I'm not really sure what's going on there. It suggests that perhaps there was less speed because there was payload in the ship at this point in time, or possibly because the new version of the Starship is heavier than the previous version was because it's got a better heat shield or something. I don't know the reason why, but it's interesting to note that the Starship is going slower in IFT7, and up until then it had been making some good forward progress in terms of speed at that point in time. If you want to use any of these figures for your own videos, you are quite welcome to. Just please make sure that you leave credit below on the Atlantis project, and if you'd like to get videos that have transparent backgrounds so that you can overlay them on something else, just let me know. I'll be probably happy to oblige you with that. Okay, this is the televised data from Starship IFT3 through IFT7, all crammed onto one slide so that you can compare the different flights all at once. It makes for a very busy slide though. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about a model that I created of a two-stage rocket. The model has lots of parameters that you can adjust to fit the model's behavior to the behavior that we see from televised broadcasts. So this is the original data from the televised broadcasts, and we have on this green line, this is the altitude of the ship, and this red line represents and part of this orange line here represents the speed of the ship versus time. Now the model can be adjusted to generate the same altitude behavior and speed behavior. So here we see the green line is a pretty good fit to the altitude data from the televised launch. And the blue line represents the speed of the model. It's also a pretty good fit, not quite as good a fit, but it's a pretty good fit to the data from the broadcast. But once you have a model that's fit to the data, you can plot other things, and those other things can give you a better insight into what the behavior of the architecture is. So for example, we can plot the mass of the model versus time. You can see that it starts here around 5 million kilograms, and it drops as the fuel in the first stage is used up, and then it drops suddenly as the super heavy separates, or the first stage separates from the second stage. We lose the mass, the dry mass of the first stage, and the mass of any remaining fuel in the first stage. Then the ship continues, and the propellant is used up, so the mass continues to drop until we get to the point where the engine's shut down. And all we're left with is the dry mass of the ship, the mass of any payload, and the mass of any fuel that's been retained for maneuvers such as the circularization of the orbit, the deorbit burn, and landing burns. Now we can also plot the orbit that the ship is on as it travels up. So the ship is on an elliptical orbit even when it's on the ground. That orbit changes over time until it becomes a pretty close to circular orbit when the ship is finally circling the Earth, or even when it's on a suborbital trajectory, it's in a kind of an elliptical orbit at that point. The red line represents the distance from the center of the Earth, or the orbital distance, for a circular orbit of 200 kilometers. The blue line represents the apogee of the elliptical orbit that the ship is on as it travels up. So that changes versus time. It starts off with the apogee of that orbit, or the apogee distance, really. The distance from the center of the Earth to the apogee is the radius of the Earth, and eventually it becomes the radius of the circular orbit at 200 kilometers. And the perigee starts off at the center of the Earth, so it starts off being 0. It's kind of like the perigee distance, and that increases as the ship gains speed. And the perigee distance doesn't quite reach the distance of the circular orbit because the ship is on a suborbital trajectory at the end of its burn. You can also plot the aerodynamic drag versus time. This gives you a bit of an idea of where max Q might be, although to properly determine that, we would need to plot the dynamic pressure versus time, which I haven't plotted here. And then you can also plot the delta V versus time. So this purple line represents the delta V versus time. And as you can see, with this particular launch, the model is estimating that the ship had a delta V with very little payload in it of around 9,400 meters per second. So that's how much velocity the architecture was able to impart on its very small payload just to reach a suborbital trajectory. That's how much it had to impart to reach a suborbital trajectory. Now, if we added more payload to the ship, that would change the amount of delta V that the ship would be able to impart to its payload. You can see that you can estimate that with the models. We added 10,000 kilograms of additional payload, then the model delta V changes from 9,400 to perhaps 9,250. And if we added 20,000 kilograms, it goes down to 9,100. Add 30,000 kilograms, it's now at 9,000, and so on and so forth. So if we added 60,000 kilograms of payload, you'd be down to perhaps 8,700 meters per second of delta V imparted to that payload. And that's not enough delta V to get the payload into orbit. And not to mention, we also need to circularize that orbit and do a deorbit burn and then finally land the vehicle. So there's a delta V shortage here. And the only way to make that up is by either increasing the ISP of the engines in some manner, which is difficult to do because of the physics and chemistry of the rocket propellants, or it's to find a way to reduce the mass of the spaceship. And that's also difficult to do because if you take mass out of the spaceship, it becomes weaker and potentially could break up during ascent. Or perhaps if you take the weight out of the heat shield tiles, then the ship won't be able to survive reentry. It won't be reusable without a lot of refurbishment. So it's a really tough set of trades to make there to get the ship's weight down. So it seems to me that this architecture has some challenges ahead in terms of reducing its mass, while at the same time, increasing its robustness so it can survive not only ascent but deorbit and landing. So I hope that was helpful. If you want to see this model and try it out, you can go down to GitHub and learn how to use it. It probably won't be easy to use right away. I'll have to provide some instructional video on that. But for now, it's just wanted to let you get a first taste. And I kind of want to encourage people to develop these kinds of models themselves and to figure out using these models whether any aspirational statements that are made about a rocket's architecture are valid or just assess how aspirational they really are, because it's important to make sure that we're investing in the right things if we really want to achieve some major milestones for humanity, such as creating a base on the moon or a city on Mars one day. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed that video and look forward to making some more for you in the future. Take care.